We talked a lot about the workforce aspect and the talent aspect in general of the corporate strategy. Let's talk a little bit about leadership, because you're in a very unique position of being a senior executive C-suite member who has lived through, shall we say, has remained through the transition of 5 CEOs. That's extraordinary. Kind of, what have you learned?
A testimony to the failure of our performance management system, probably.
Well, that's because you have the inside track on it. You're like, but when we had this, we had a pre-conversation about this, and I think when I asked sort of, the impact of the change of a CEO on a corporate strategy, you really recognize that in hindsight, there's lessons learned in that transition, but also you really were able to identify and recognize that you had the right leaders at the right time. How much of that can actually be put into a forecast for the C-suite, and meaning how do you link your CEO and your C-suite with a corporate strategy going forward? But then also some of the lessons learned of how to transition or onboard the CEO, and obviously, I guess they always say when you have a high performance team, anytime you change a member, you give them a promotion, you change a member out, you have to reform that high performance team. How have you been able to do that in your position as head of HR for BAE? I know that's a tri-level question.
Yeah, there's a lot. I was going to say there's a lot in that question. So let me try to take them in turn. First of all, I do think you're right, and reflecting our prior conversation, I do think whether we were excellent planners or it just worked out that way, I think in our case, I've worked for all 5 CEOs. In fact, I'm the only senior executive that goes back to the original leadership team. And if I think about them, kind of in turn.
When you say original leadership team, that's when BAE actually stood up and became BAE.
Right. I joined, BAE Systems was formed in the latter part of 1999 with the merger of Marconi and BAE Systems. They had a small U.S. operation, very much treated like the colonies back then. So the original CEO, Mark Ronald, part of the corporate strategy was this is the biggest defense market in the world. We have this foothold. We want to grow that foothold. So Mark, gets a lot of the credit for he built us. He acquisitions like Sanders and things like that, Tracor were kind of our fundamental building blocks. Gave us a foothold in some critical technology areas to where we were a real business. Because when I joined, we had, about 12,000 employees, and we were doing about $2 billion then. At our peak in 2008, we had grown to 57,000, 60,000 employees here in the U.S., and we're doing $20 billion in turnover. So it was a lot. Well, Mark built, the biggest building blocks of that. Things like the United Defense acquisition and the Armor Holdings acquisition. I mean, those were big chunks, chunks, right? And he had a good career, he built a good business, he retired. God bless him. He was replaced by Walt Havenstein. What Walt did, why I say we've had the right leaders, so Mark built this strong organization. Well, Walt breathed a soul into it. He got us focused on, hey, what we're really about is we protect those who protect us. And that he permeated that kind of cultural anchor, and it remains an anchor to our culture today. So he breathed a soul into it. Right. Well, he'd done a good job. He got recruited away by another company for a bigger job. So we had General Tony Zinni as an interim CEO. And what Tony taught me, and I think he taught the organization, was, and if you think about his military background, empowering leaders. You know what I mean? So he was really, I'm not running this business, we're running this business. So he kind of built that in to the leadership. And each one of those things, so Mark builds an organization. Walt instills a cultural anchor. Tony starts to build a mindset about how to lead. And I mean, these, that's one change, but this, CEOs are strong are in strong positions, and these are strong leaders. So those lessons permeated through. So then Linda Hudson took over. And Linda, because now we were a big organization and successful and doing really well, she raised our profile and raised our thinking. So like, look, we're not just nobody. There's Lockheed, there's Boeing, there's Raytheon, there's us, we are among the top defense companies in the world. And we should lead that way and be aggressive that way. And so she raised our profile but raised our thinking.
Right.
So she retired, and then we got our current CEO, Jerry DeMuro. And so when Linda left, the downturn in defense happened, and what Jerry has brought is kind of a discipline and a real business, real business mindset. And one of the most important things to me is portfolio thinking. That it's, hey, we may be organized into 3 sectors, but we're really in 23 businesses. And that actually translates to our conversation about talent, because it's what is the talent portfolio that we have and that we need. So this idea of portfolio thinking, and that there's lots of levers to be turned. And so each one of these leaders, now I've distilled a lot of good work down to a few bullet points, but they brought some unique areas of focus to how we think about and manage our function or our line of business, and how the organization works. Each one changed the answer to this question a little bit. One of the questions I always love when you're interviewing somebody or you're integrating new people into the organization is you want to answer the question, what's it like to work here, right?
Yes.
And each one of those leaders changed that answer in sometimes subtle but always important ways of what's it like to work here. And and that's a lesson we try to now instill to all of our individual leaders, is how do you want your employees to answer that question? You own that answer.
Yeah. And it's interesting also how fortunate BAE is that they were able to maintain you with your strategic view of HR, because every element that you talked about, the CEO's impact, needed to be evolved through each of those different 5 leaders, right? So what you keep in order that you sustain the culture, but you also are agile enough that your culture tracks both your corporate strategy as well as the reality of the world. Right. So one of the questions is, so what was your role in helping define or think about the CEO's position or type of CEO that you would want to look for? Because I know that you used executive search for each one, which I think is not just a personal plug, but I do think it's a smart idea for any of your senior positions to have an outside objective group pull together the right slate. So how do you define the right slate? And then that also leads into what was the board's role in defining the specifics of an individual?
Well, I'll start with the latter part of that question first, because one of the fundamental roles of the board, I mean, obviously they're representing the shareholders' interest. In the case of the public company board, the parent company board. In the case of BAE Systems Inc., it's an SSA board, which means they're representing the interests of the U.S. government, relative to our, delivery of U.S. defense articles and things like that. But in both cases, one of their fundamental responsibilities is assuring that we have the right leader.
Sort of two major roles of the board, right? So they have to have meaningful input into the development, implementation, and monitoring of your corporate strategy. And CEO hiring, firing, and succession planning.
Exactly.
Those are the 2 key things that a board should be most concerned about.
I agree with, and that was certainly the case with us. 2 of the most important meetings that we have, certainly ones that, at least that I'm involved in, are when we're going through the succession plans, the talent reviews of the CEO and of all the key leaders in the organization. And I can tell you there's never been the case when that has not been taken as a serious responsibility on their part. Absolutely. And so they get engaged in conversations about each of the leaders, each of the successors. In fact, in our case, we arrange that all key successors are invited sometimes to the board meetings, filling an quote an empty chair. Breakfast, dinners, opportunities to present to the board, because we want the board has to feel comfortable with, and more importantly, confident in, who are the next gen, not just are our incumbents performing, but do we have the next leader? Do we have the next generation of leaders? Right. And so in the answer to now the specific part of your question, in each of those CEO searches, each time we transitioned to CEO, they were intimately involved, first of all, in, they knew who the internal candidates would be, but in terms of defining there's a job description for the CEO, and of course that's reviewed with the board and that kind of thing, but a job description, as you know, is more a marketing tool. But in our case, we really try to focus on what are the 5 or 6 must-haves. What must this person have a proven record of having done, or knowing, or experiencing, that we will use not just to screen candidates. If they don't have it, they're not a candidate. More importantly, it's the decision-making criteria on who are you going to choose. And so in our case, we use a selection panel made up of board members and myself, and usually a representative of the parent company. And a lot of times we use not a completely structured interview, but we use interview guides to say, look, these are the 5 areas we want to focus on. Here's some questions you can use to try to really get at, does this person have that experience? Not just were they in the room when it happened, but do they have that experience? Do they do it? What was their role? And what part did they play, and how did they do it? And that's served us pretty well.
How much do you take into account the competency of the rest of the C-suite, right? So when I build out teams for startup technology companies, I always look at the C-suite in the aggregate, right?
Yes.
So a lot of times the CEO is viewed as your external face, and the chief operating officer is your internal person. But so where do you find the balance for your CEO, and do you take into account the competencies that you have in the C-suite?
We do. What we try to do is blend 2 things. One, probably 3 things now that I think about it. One, where are we trying to go? Where are we trying to go as an organization? Which which parts of the market are going to grow versus not grow, that kind of thing. And that steers if this is where we're going, you want to bias your skill set obviously towards the areas you're trying to grow in. Secondly, to your point, it's what's the kind of the health, the competency set of the current team. What's going to add to that? What's going to complement it? What's going to, CEOs, they conduct orchestras, right? And they don't have to be able to play first chair cello, but they have to be able to conduct the cello section with all the other sections. So you're kind of looking at the health and the makeup of that section of the orchestra to say, well, hey, let's say I'll make one up. We're weak. We're not as strong as we would like to be relative to strategy. So now you're going to lean in on that relative to your candidates, saying, hey, this person's going to have to be able to not just bring the strategic vision, but the strategic thinking that leads to the creation of the actual strategy document. And so you kind of look at what skill set are we trying to complement. And then the third component of that is the cultural fit.
Right.
What impact this person is going to have an impact on this culture.
Yes.
What impact do we need?
Right.
I'll give you an example. With Jerry.
And they can be used to change a culture as much as it is to reinforce the culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like I'll use Jerry as the example.
Yep.
In big complex organizations like ours, an area of challenge is always how is accountability parsed out?
Yeah.
How is accountability delegated, and then how is it managed? And that was an area where, in this case, the board thought, we needed to up our game a little bit, particularly because we were coming through this downturn and now going to enter growth. That's a different skill set to grow, right? And so one of the things that we were looking for and got with Jerry was, he has really clear thinking about that, and more importantly, he had a proven record of operating in his role, like how he reviews the businesses during the quarterly business reviews is a perfect example. Well, he changed the way we do it so that it instilled this sense of accountability.
Yes.
And it was a fairly simple change in the way we do it, but it has resonated throughout our organization. But that's an example where one of the board's roles is to kind of think about that and try to suss out, what is the subtle change that they think is needed, and what kind of leader can do that.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun, a lot of work.
So I'm
only 26. Look how bad I look. It's been a lot of work.
That's right. That's right. Well, I have to say, hands down, you are one of the very few of the true strategic chief human resource officers that I've come across. The one that really knows how to integrate human capital and make it a competitive advantage for BAE Systems. So I can't thank you enough for your time
Well,
today.
that's a great compliment. I've worked for a lot of great people who have taught me a lot, and I try to apply. I'll give myself the credit of I try to apply those lessons.
Yeah, great.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.